Welcome to Peaceful Stories, the channel where we dive into the darkest corners of history, exposing shocking tales that still haunt us today. In this episode, we bring you the life and crimes of Dorothea Puente, the grandmotherly serial killer, whose gruesome actions shocked the world. Dorothea operated a boarding house for the vulnerable, but her true business was murder. From a deeply troubled childhood to becoming one of the most calculating killers in modern history, we will unravel the story of how this kindly-looking woman committed unthinkable atrocities. Stay tuned for a journey through manipulation, murder, and mystery. This is the terrifying legacy of Dorothea Puente. Dorothea Puente, the early years of a troubled life. Dorothea Helen Gray, born on January 9, 1929, in Redlands, California, came into the world under dark circumstances that set the stage for a tragic and tumultuous life. Her father, Jesse James Gray, a migrant cotton picker, and her mother, Trudy Mae Yates, a sex worker, were both deeply troubled individuals. Both were alcoholics who neglected their children, subjecting Dorothea and her siblings to an abusive and chaotic household. Their instability and neglect contributed to Dorothea's early development of coping mechanisms centered around lying, manipulation, and a disregard for the rules of normal society. From an early age, Dorothea learned that vulnerability could be exploited. Her father, mentally unstable, would routinely threaten to kill himself in front of his children, introducing Dorothea to trauma and emotional manipulation at a tender age. He succumbed to tuberculosis when Dorothea was just 8 years old, an event that may have reinforced her detachment from others and inability to form healthy emotional connections. Her mother, incapable of providing a nurturing environment, died shortly after in a car accident, leaving Dorothea and her siblings orphans. This event led to the children being placed in various foster homes and an orphanage where abuse was common and care was in short supply. These formative experiences of being passed around, neglected, and abused left an indelible mark on Dorothea's psyche, hardening her toward others and nurturing the seeds of what would later grow into her predatory behavior. Adolescence and early adulthood. Crime and deceit become second nature. Dorothea's teenage years were marked by a rapid descent into criminal behavior. In 1945, at the age of 16, she escaped the confines of her orphan life by marrying a soldier named Fred McFall. The marriage was brief and tumultuous, producing 2 daughters. Both children were quickly out of Dorothea's life. One was placed for adoption, and the other was sent to live with relatives. This early abandonment of her own children was a clear indication of her emotional detachment. Dorothea's life continued to spiral as she turned to prostitution in Olympia, Washington, to support herself, honing her ability to manipulate men for survival. During this period, Dorothea also began forging documents and committing small-time fraud, skills that would later serve her in her more nefarious endeavors. In 1948, she was arrested for forging checks and spent time in jail, but this experience did little to reform her. Instead, it reinforced her belief that she could use lies and deception to escape her circumstances. This period of her life shows a chilling progression from simple survival through manipulation to an ingrained belief that the rules did not apply to her. The tumultuous years of marriage and crime. Dorothea's second marriage, to Axel Johansson, a Swedish merchant seaman in 1952, lasted 14 stormy years. Axel's long absences due to his work left Dorothea free to engage in her criminal activities. When Axel was home, their relationship was characterized by constant conflict, much of it fueled by Dorothea's excessive drinking and gambling. She frequently disappeared for days at a time, often under the pretense of attending charity work, but in reality, engaging in petty theft, scams, and cons. During this time, Dorothea further perfected her ability to forge documents, which allowed her to steal from the various men she conned into thinking she was someone she wasn't. She presented herself as a good Samaritan, a caregiver for those in need, but in reality, she was setting the groundwork for the deadly schemes that would soon make her infamous. By the time the marriage ended in 1966, Dorothea had moved fully into a life of crime. The transformation from criminal to killer. In the 1970s, Dorothea's transition from a petty criminal to a cold-blooded killer began. She opened a boarding house in Sacramento, California, taking in tenants who were elderly, mentally ill, or otherwise vulnerable. At first, the operation seemed legitimate, and Dorothea appeared to be a compassionate caretaker. However, her true motive was financial exploitation. She targeted individuals who were receiving government assistance, such as Social Security or disability checks, taking control of their finances by coercing or manipulating them into signing over their checks to her. Dorothea's methods of manipulation were sophisticated. She created a grandmotherly persona that inspired trust in her tenants, her neighbors, and even local authorities. By this time, she had mastered the art of deception, presenting herself as a generous and kind-hearted caretaker, all while siphoning her tenants' money and plotting more sinister ways to profit off them. In 1978, Dorothea was arrested and convicted of drugging and robbing elderly men in local bars, a pattern of behavior that revealed her willingness to use drugs to incapacitate her victims. After serving a short sentence in jail, she was released on probation, and it wasn't long before she returned to her old ways, this time with deadly intent. The boarding house murders, a gruesome operation. By the early 1980s, Dorothea had established her boarding house as a seemingly safe place for society's most vulnerable, those without families or who had been abandoned by the social safety net. But behind the closed doors of 1426 F Street in Sacramento, a nightmarish scenario was unfolding. Dorothea's method of killing was as calculated as it was cruel. She would carefully select tenants who had little to no family connections, individuals whose absence might go unnoticed for long periods. Once they were living in her house, Dorothea would drug them with tranquilizers or sleeping pills, rendering them incapable of defending themselves or escaping. She often used powerful sedatives like Valium, which, when administered in large doses, would cause the victim to overdose. Once incapacitated, the victims were left to die, either through drug overdoses or from other means such as suffocation. Dorothea was meticulous about how she handled the bodies. She would wrap them in cloth or plastic, and, in a shocking display of cold calculation, she buried them in shallow graves in her backyard. To further conceal her crimes, she continued to collect their Social Security checks, forging signatures and altering documents to keep the money flowing into her accounts. The victims, trapped and forgotten souls. Dorothea Puente's victims were often those whom society had already forgotten. Many of them were elderly, disabled, mentally ill, or struggling with addiction. They came to her boarding house looking for safety and stability, only to find themselves prey to a calculating and ruthless killer. Here's a closer look at some of the known victims. Leona Carpenter. At 78 years old, Carpenter was one of the first tenants to fall victim to Puente's sinister plot. Carpenter had recently been discharged from a hospital and needed a place to stay where she could recover. Tragically, her recovery was short-lived, as she was drugged and killed shortly after moving into Puente's home. Her body was later found buried in the backyard. Benjamin Fink, a 55-year-old man struggling with alcoholism, Fink was another one of Puente's victims. He was drugged and killed in 1987, his body buried among others in the small garden that Puente meticulously maintained. Neighbors would often compliment her on the beauty of her flowers, unaware that the rich soil they admired was fed by the decomposing bodies beneath it. Dorothy Miller, a 64-year-old woman, Dorothy Miller was another victim whose Social Security checks Puente forged after her death. Like the others, she was drugged and buried in the backyard. Miller's disappearance went unnoticed for months, as Puente continued to cash her checks. James Gallup. Gallup was in his late 60s and suffering from alcoholism and depression. He moved into Puente's boarding house for a fresh start, but like so many others, he was drugged and killed. There were other victims whose remains were found in Puente's backyard, but their identities and specific circumstances remain uncertain due to the state of decomposition and lack of concrete records. Puente was a master at selecting victims who had no one to advocate for them, ensuring that their disappearances would raise no alarms for months, or even years. The investigation. The fall of Dorothea Puente. Dorothea Puente's facade of the caring landlady began to crack in 1988 when suspicions were raised about the disappearance of one of her tenants, 51-year-old Alberto Montoya. Montoya, a mentally ill man with schizophrenia, had been placed in Puente's care by social workers. When he stopped showing up for his regular meetings, social workers became concerned and alerted the police. What started as a routine welfare check quickly escalated into one of the most shocking murder investigations in Sacramento's history. Detectives arrived at Puente's boarding house to question her, and she cooperated fully, inviting them into her home. The house itself was tidy and unassuming, filled with the normal trappings of an elderly woman's residence: knickknacks, crocheted blankets, and soft lighting. There was nothing to suggest that anything was amiss. But when detectives began interviewing the tenants, some of them expressed concerns. They mentioned strange occurrences, disappearing housemates, odd smells emanating from the backyard, and Dorothea's unusual behavior. One tenant mentioned that Dorothea had told them not to dig too deeply in the garden. Based on this testimony, detectives requested permission to dig in the backyard, a request that Puente granted, though she seemed oddly calm about the whole situation. What they discovered would forever change the perception of the sweet, elderly landlady. The first body unearthed was that of Leona Carpenter, and the discovery sent shockwaves through the Sacramento community. As police continued to dig, they found several more bodies buried in shallow graves throughout the garden. The forensic team quickly realized they were dealing with a prolific killer. In total, they found 7 bodies buried on Puente's property. Despite the overwhelming evidence piling up, Puente remained calm and composed. She even maintained her innocence, offering explanations for each body found. However, the sheer number of victims was impossible to ignore. Dorothea's escape and arrest. As the police investigation gained momentum, Puente managed to convince the detectives that she needed to step out briefly to buy a cup of coffee. Incredibly, they allowed her to leave, still unaware of the full extent of her crimes. This was a critical mistake, as Puente took the opportunity to flee Sacramento, boarding a bus to Los Angeles. Puente managed to elude capture for several days, blending into the city as just another elderly woman. However, her flight came to an end when a man she had befriended in a Los Angeles bar recognized her from news reports and alerted the authorities. She was arrested without incident and extradited back to Sacramento to face charges of multiple murders. The trial, a chilling testimony of greed and deceit. Dorothea Puente's trial began in October 1992 and lasted for several months. It was one of the most highly publicized trials in California at the time, as the public grappled with the horror of an elderly woman committing such gruesome crimes. The prosecution painted a picture of a cold, calculating killer who preyed on the vulnerable for financial gain. Their evidence included forged documents, witness testimonies, and most damningly, the bodies discovered in Puente's backyard. The defense, on the other hand, attempted to portray Puente as a victim of circumstance. They argued that she suffered from a troubled upbringing and mental health issues, and that she wasn't responsible for the deaths, insisting that she was simply helping those in need and that the deaths were accidental or the result of overdose. Her attorney claimed that Dorothea didn't bury the bodies to hide murder, but rather to avoid unnecessary trouble with authorities, knowing she could be blamed due to her criminal past. The trial captivated the public, as Puente sat in court looking every bit the sweet grandmother, showing little emotion or remorse. Her calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the gruesome nature of the crimes. The sheer audacity of her defense strategy, combined with the severity of her crimes, created an intense atmosphere in the courtroom. In the end, the jury was not convinced by the defense's argument. On August 26, 1993, Dorothea Puente was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. However, the jury could not reach a consensus on 6 other counts of murder. Even with only 3 formal convictions, Puente would spend the rest of her life in prison. Psychological profile: the mind of Dorothea Puente. Understanding what drove Dorothea Puente to commit such heinous acts requires a deep dive into her psychological makeup. While many serial killers are motivated by power, control, or sexual desire, Puente's primary motive was financial gain. This is not to say that her actions were any less sinister. If anything, her ability to compartmentalize the lives and deaths of her victims for monetary profit is a chilling indicator of her remorselessness and cold-hearted nature. Psychologists who studied Puente's case suggest that she displayed characteristics consistent with sociopathy. Her complete lack of empathy for her victims, combined with her ability to manipulate others into trusting her, points to a deep-seated personality disorder. Sociopaths often lead lives of deception and lies, much like Puente, who managed to hide her true nature behind a carefully constructed persona of kindness and care. Her childhood trauma, including the early loss of her parents and her experiences in foster care, may have contributed to her inability to form meaningful emotional connections. These early experiences may have shaped her belief that people were tools to be used for her own benefit, rather than individuals with inherent worth. As she aged, this detachment evolved into something far more sinister, with Puente using her boarding house as a front for her deadly schemes. The aftermath and legacy. Dorothea Puente's crimes sent shockwaves through Sacramento and the broader American public. For years, she had managed to fly under the radar, operating with impunity as she preyed on the most vulnerable members of society. Her case highlighted several critical issues within the social safety net system, particularly the lack of oversight and protection for individuals receiving government assistance. Her ability to manipulate Social Security checks and take advantage of her tenants without raising red flags exposed deep flaws in how these systems were managed at the time. After her conviction, Puente was sent to the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla, where she lived out the remainder of her days. Despite her life sentence, Puente continued to maintain her innocence, never admitting to the murders for which she had been convicted. She died on March 27, 2011, at the age of 82, from natural causes. Her story remains one of the most infamous examples of a serial killer hiding in plain sight, able to continue her deadly work for years due to her unassuming appearance and the trust she managed to inspire in those around her. The case has been the subject of multiple documentaries, books, and podcasts, each attempting to unravel the mystery of how such a seemingly harmless woman could commit such monstrous acts. Thank you for joining us on this dark journey into the life and crimes of Dorothea Puente. Her story serves as a chilling reminder that evil can often hide in the most unexpected places. The people she preyed on were the ones society had forgotten, but their stories will never be forgotten. If you found this video insightful and want to hear more about true crime cases, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell to stay updated on all of our future videos. Until next time, stay safe and remember, things are not always as they seem.